The sound of shattering crystal silenced the entire dining room of the Gilded Lily, Manhattan's most exclusive restaurant. Richard Sterling, a man whose net worth exceeded the GDP of small countries, stood over the table, his face twisted in a snarl that didn't match his bespoke Italian suit. He pointed a manicured finger at the trembling waitress, Sarah, and shouted the words that would ruin his life. "Get this filth out of my sight! I don't interact with poverty, and I certainly don't let it serve me dinner." The manager rushed forward, sweating, ready to fire Sarah on the spot. But Sarah didn't cry. She didn't run. She simply looked Richard in the eye, adjusted her apron, and whispered one sentence. A sentence that made the billionaire's face drain of all color and drop his glass of vintage Pinot Noir to the floor. Sarah Bennett woke up before the alarm could ring, a habit born of anxiety rather than discipline. The glowing red numbers on her cracked phone screen read 4:30 a.m. Outside the frosted window of her basement apartment in Queens, the city was still asleep, but Sarah's mind was already racing through a mental ledger of debts. Rent was 3 days late, the pharmacy bill for her mother's insulin was due on Friday, and the radiator in the corner hissed and sputtered, threatening to die completely before the winter freeze truly set in. She rolled out of bed, the cold floorboards biting at her bare feet. In the next room, her 5-year-old son, Toby, was sleeping soundly, clutching the worn-out teddy bear that was missing an eye. Sarah paused at the door, watching the gentle rise and fall of his chest. He was the reason she endured the humiliation, the double shifts, and the aching exhaustion that settled deep in her bones. She needed this job. She needed the tips. Sarah worked at the Gilded Lily, a restaurant so upscale that the menu didn't list prices. It was located in the heart of the Upper East Side, a fortress of glass and marble where the city's elite came to eat truffles shaved over gold leaf risotto. Sarah was the newest addition to the staff, a trial hire brought on because the head waiter, a kind but frazzled man named Elias, had seen the desperation in her eyes during the interview. "You have to be invisible, Sarah," Elias had warned her yesterday. "These people, they pay for the food, but they are buying the atmosphere. They don't want to see your struggles. They don't want to know you exist outside of refilling their wine." She splashed cold water on her face in the tiny bathroom, staring at her reflection. Dark circles bruised the skin under her eyes, and her uniform, a crisp white button-down and black slacks, hung slightly loose on her frame. She had lost weight recently, skipping meals to ensure Toby and her mother had enough. "Just get through today," she whispered to the mirror. Just one more shift. The commute was a brutal hour-long slog, involving 2 buses and a subway transfer. By the time Sarah arrived at the employee entrance of the restaurant, the morning sun was reflecting off the skyscrapers of Manhattan, blinding and indifferent. Inside, the kitchen was already a war zone of controlled chaos. Chef Jean-Luc, a man with a temper as sharp as his Japanese steel knives, was barking orders in a mix of French and English. "Bennett!" Jean-Luc shouted, without looking up from a saucepan of reduction. "Table 4 is reserved for a VIP lunch at noon. Richard Sterling. You know who that is?" Sarah froze while tying her apron. The name sent a jolt of recognition through her, though she couldn't place exactly why. I think so, Chef. The tech mogul." "The shark," Jean-Luc corrected, tasting a sauce and grimacing. "He buys companies, strips them for parts, and leaves the employees to starve. He's worth billions and tips like he's broke. He demands perfection. If the water glass is half empty for more than 10 seconds, he screams, 'Elias is out sick today. You're taking the table.'" Panic fluttered in Sarah's chest. "Chef, I've only been on the floor for 3 days. Surely Marcus or Jessica should take a VIP." Marcus is hungover, and Jessica is handling the senator's party in the private room, Jean-Luc snapped. You're up. Don't speak unless spoken to. Pour from the right. And for the love of God, don't look him in the eye. He hates that. Sarah nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. She moved to the front of the house to set the table. The tablecloth was white linen, pressed to such perfection it looked like a sheet of ice. The silverware was heavy, solid silver that cost more than her entire apartment's furniture. As she polished a wine glass, her hand trembled slightly. She needed this shift to go well. If she got a good tip from a billionaire, it could cover the pharmacy bill. It could mean breathing room. She didn't know that Richard Sterling wasn't just coming for lunch. He was coming to celebrate a victory, a hostile takeover that had just put 3,000 people out of work in Ohio, and he was in the mood to crush anyone else who got in his way, even a waitress. The clock struck noon, and the atmosphere in the restaurant shifted. The ambient music, a soft jazz piano, seemed to lower in volume as the heavy oak doors swung open. Richard Sterling entered like a storm front. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, wearing a navy suit that fit him like a second skin. He had the kind of face that was handsome in a magazine, but terrifying in person. Cold blue eyes, a jaw set in permanent judgment, and a mouth that looked like it had forgotten how to smile. Flanking him were two younger men, associates in grey suits who carried leather portfolios and looked nervous. They were the remoras swimming alongside the shark, hoping to eat the scraps. The maître d', a polished Frenchman named Claude, bowed lower than usual. "Mr. Sterling, welcome back. Your usual table is ready." Richard didn't acknowledge Claude. He simply walked past him, his eyes scanning the room as if he owned it. He probably could buy it if he wanted to. He sat at table 4, the best seat in the house, overlooking the park. Sarah stood by the service station, her heart hammering against her ribs. She took a deep breath, grabbed the pitcher of ice water, and approached the table. "Good afternoon, gentlemen," Sarah said, her voice steady despite her nerves. "May I start you with some—" Richard held up a hand, silencing her without even looking at her. He continued talking to the associate on his right. "I don't care about the pension fund, Michael. Liquidate it. If they didn't save for retirement, that's their problem, not mine. I want that factory closed by Monday." Sarah stood frozen, the heavy pitcher sweating in her hand. The associate, Michael, looked up at her with apologetic eyes, but Richard ignored her completely. It was a power move she had seen before, but never with this level of cruelty. To him, she was furniture. After a long, agonizing minute, Richard finally turned his head. He didn't look at her face. He looked at her shoes. They were sensible black work shoes, scuffed at the toe because she couldn't afford new ones. His gaze traveled up to her frayed cups, then finally to her face. He sneered. "Water," he said, the word dripping with disdain, "and bring the wine list. The real one. Not the one you show the tourists." "Yes, sir," Sarah said softly. She poured the water with precision, terrified of spilling a drop. As she reached across to fill Michael's glass, her sleeve rode up slightly, revealing a small, faded scar on her wrist. Richard's eyes narrowed on the scar. He recoiled as if he had seen a cockroach. "Stop!" he barked. The entire section of the restaurant went quiet. Sarah froze, the pitcher suspended in mid-air. "Sir?" Richard pushed his chair back, the legs scraping harshly against the floor. "What is that on your wrist?" Sarah quickly pulled her sleeve down. "It's nothing, sir. Just an old burn mark from cooking." "It looks like a disease," Richard said loudly, his voice carrying to the nearby tables. "It looks like hygiene is merely a suggestion for you." "I assure you, sir, I am perfectly clean," Sarah said, her face burning. "I wash my hands before every—" "I don't want to hear your life story," Richard snapped. He waved a hand at Claude, the maître d', who was rushing over. "Claude, what is the meaning of this? I come here for excellence. I come here to escape the filth of the city. Why is there a woman serving me who looks like she just crawled out of a homeless shelter?" Sarah felt the tears pricking her eyes, hot and stinging. She gripped the pitcher tighter. "Don't cry," she told herself. "Think of Toby. Think of the insulin." "Mr. Sterling, I apologize," Claude stammered, looking terrified. "Sarah is new. She is still in training." "She's a blight on the scenery," Richard sneered, looking back at Sarah with pure malice. "Look at her. The cheap shoes, the desperate eyes. It ruins my appetite. I don't serve poor people in my companies, and I certainly don't let them serve me my lunch." He turned back to Sarah, a cruel smirk playing on his lips. "How much do they pay you here? Minimum wage? Do you even know what a 1982 Bordeaux is? Or is the height of your culinary knowledge opening a can of beans?" The associates chuckled nervously, trying to stay on Richard's good side. Sarah stood there, the humiliation washing over her like acid. But beneath the shame, something else was bubbling up, a memory, a connection. She looked at Richard, really looked at him, not as the billionaire titan of industry, but at the structure of his face, the specific way his left eyebrow twitched when he was angry. And suddenly, the years melted away. The image of the billionaire overlaid with a much younger, much more desperate face she had known a lifetime ago. She remembered a rainy night in Chicago, 15 years ago. She remembered a young man shivering in a hallway, begging for a chance. She remembered a name that wasn't Richard Sterling. Richard picked up his empty wine glass and held it out to her, mocking her. "Well? Are you going to fetch someone competent, or are you going to stand there looking pathetic?" Sarah placed the water pitcher down on the table with a definitive clink. The sound was loud enough to make Richard pause. She didn't retreat. She didn't call for the manager. She took a half-step closer to the table, entering his personal space. "I can certainly get the manager, Richard," she said, her voice dropping, the customer service sweetness and taking on a tone of steel. Richard blinked, surprised by her use of his first name. "Excuse me?" Sarah leaned in, so only he and his associates could hear. "But if you fire me, who's going to remind you of the promise you made to Arthur Penhaligon on the night you stole his life's work?" The silence that followed Sarah's whisper was absolute. It wasn't the quiet of an empty room. It was the suffocating vacuum of a room holding its breath. Richard Sterling's face, previously a mask of arrogant boredom, drained of color so rapidly it looked as though his heart had stopped beating. The heavy crystal wine glass he had been holding slipped from his fingers. It hit the marble floor with a violence that sounded like a gunshot, shattering into 1,000 glittering shards. The dark red Pinot Noir splashed across his pristine Italian leather shoes and the cuffs of his trousers, looking disturbingly like blood. "Sir!" Claude, the maître d', rushed forward, his face pale with panic. A busboy scrambled behind him with a broom and dustpan. "Mr. Sterling, I am so sorry. Sarah, step back, immediately. You are dismissed. Get your things and—" "Get out," Richard whispered. His voice was hoarse, unrecognizable. Claude froze. "Sir, I assure you, she will be terminated immediately. We will comp your entire meal and—" "I said get out!" Richard roared, slamming his fist onto the table. The silverware jumped. "Everyone, leave this table, now!" He turned his shark-like gaze to his two associates, Michael and the other young man, who were staring at him in bewildered terror. "You two as well. Go wait in the car. Take the files. Go." "But Richard, the merger discussion," Michael stammered. "Get." Out! Richard hissed the words through clenched teeth. The two men scrambled out of their chairs, grabbing their briefcases and practically running toward the exit. Claude, terrified and confused, waved the busboy away and retreated to the far side of the dining room, watching from a distance like a captain, watching his ship hit an iceberg. Sarah did not move. She stood amidst the broken glass and spilled wine, her hands clasped in front of her apron. Her heart was beating so hard she could hear it in her ears, a frantic drumbeat of adrenaline. She had played her card. There was no going back now. Richard slowly sat back down, his breathing heavy. He looked at the empty chairs where his associates had been, then slowly, reluctantly, brought his gaze back to the waitress he had called Filth moments ago. "Arthur Penhaligon," Richard said, testing the name on his tongue as if it were poison. "That name has been buried for 15 years. Buried deep." "Some things don't stay buried, Richard," Sarah said, her voice trembling slightly but gaining strength. "Especially when you bury them alive." Richard picked up a napkin and dabbed at the wine on his cuff, trying to regain his composure. He was a master of the boardroom, a man who crushed competitors for sport. He couldn't let a waitress see him sweat. "Who are you? A reporter? A corporate spy sent by Tech Corp?" "I'm none of those things," Sarah said. She reached into her apron pocket. Richard flinched, perhaps expecting a weapon, but she only pulled out a small, cheap notepad she used for taking orders. She placed it on the table. "I'm the woman whose father died of a heart attack in a one-room apartment because he couldn't afford the medication you're currently buying with his money," Sarah said. "I'm Sarah Penhaligon." Richard stared at her. Penhaligon didn't have a daughter. He was a loner, a recluse. That was his problem. He had no vision, no connections, no family. "He had a family he protected from you," Sarah countered, her eyes flashing. "He knew what you were, even back then. He knew you were charming and ambitious and completely hollow. He kept us out of the meetings because he didn't want your greed to infect his home. But he told me everything, Richard. He told me about the nights in the garage. He told me about the code." Richard let out a short, incredulous laugh. He leaned back, crossing his arms. The initial shock was fading, replaced by his habitual arrogance. "The code? You mean the mess of algorithms he scribbled on napkins?" Arthur was a dreamer, Sarah. "He couldn't productize water in a desert. I took his mess and built an empire. I did him a favor." "You stole the source code for the Stirling engine," Sarah said clearly. "The compression algorithm that made you your first billion. You didn't write a line of it. You copied it from his hard drive while he was sleeping on the couch, and then you locked him out of the server the next morning." Richard's eyes narrowed. He looked around the restaurant to ensure no one was within earshot. The other diners were pretending not to look, but the tension in the room was palpable. "History is written by the victors, Sarah," Richard said softly, his voice dropping to a menacing purr. "And I won. Arthur is dead. I am here, eating lunch in a place you can't afford to walk into without a uniform. What do you hope to achieve with this little ambush? Do you want money? Is that it? You want a payout?" He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a checkbook bound in black leather. "I can write you a check right now for $10,000. That's probably more than you make in a year. Take it, walk out the back door, and never say my name again." Sarah looked at the checkbook. $10,000. It would pay the rent. It would pay for the insulin. It would buy Toby new clothes and maybe a decent toy. For a split second, the desperation of her poverty clawed at her throat. But then she remembered her father. She remembered Arthur sitting at the kitchen table, his head in his hands, weeping not because he had lost the money, but because his best friend had betrayed him. She remembered the light going out of his eyes years before his heart actually stopped. "I don't want your money, Richard," Sarah said. "Everyone wants my money," Richard sneered. 20,000. Don't be stupid. You have a kid, right? I saw the toy car in your pocket earlier. Think about the kid." "His name is Toby," Sarah said, her voice hardening. "And I am thinking about him. I'm thinking I don't want him to grow up in a world where men like you win just because you have the biggest checkbook." Richard ripped a check out of the book and slammed it on the table. He hadn't filled it out. "Fill in the number. 50,000. That's my final offer. Take it and disappear." Sarah looked at the blank check. She reached out and picked it up. Richard smiled, a cold, victorious smirk. He thought he had won. He always won. Sarah slowly tore the check in half, then in quarters. She let the pieces flutter down onto the table, landing on the spilled wine. "I don't want a payoff," Sarah said. "I want a confession." Richard stared at the confetti of paper on the table, his jaw tightening until a muscle leaped in his cheek. He had never been refused. Not by senators, not by CEOs, and certainly not by service staff. "You're a fool," Richard spat. "You have nothing. You are a waitress with a story. I am a pillar of the economy. If you go to the press, I will bury you. I will sue you for defamation until your grandchildren are paying off the legal fees. I will make sure you never work in this city again." "You can try," Sarah said. She felt a strange calm settling over her. The worst had already happened. He knew who she was, and she had refused his money. The bridge was burned. Now, she only had the truth. "But you're forgetting something, Richard. Arthur wasn't just a dreamer. He was paranoid." Richard paused. "What does that mean?" "Arthur knew you were getting greedy," Sarah lied. She didn't know if her father had known, but she needed Richard to believe it. She needed to bluff. "He knew you were looking for a way to cut him out. So, he made a failsafe." Richard laughed, but it sounded forced. "A failsafe? Arthur couldn't even remember to tie his shoes. He didn't have the spine for corporate espionage." "He didn't need a spine. He needed a floppy disk," Sarah said. "June 14th, 2009, the night before you locked him out. He made a backup of the original source code. But not just the code, Richard. The metadata, the timestamps, the user logs showing you accessing his account at 3 a.m. to copy the files." Richard went very still. The air conditioning in the restaurant seemed to hum louder. Sarah pressed her advantage. "He kept it in a safety deposit box. He gave me the key before he died. He told me, 'Sarah, if Richard ever tries to erase me, you open this box.' I haven't opened it in 15 years because I just wanted to move on. I wanted to forget. But then you walked in here today. You looked at me with that disgust. You treated me like I was garbage because my shoes were old." She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "And I realized, you haven't changed. You're still the same thief you were back then. And you don't deserve the life you stole." Richard's mind was racing. He was running calculations at a frantic pace. Could Arthur have made a backup? It was possible. The man was a genius, albeit a disorganized one. If there was a digital paper trail proving Richard had stolen the intellectual property that founded Sterling Tech, the stock would plummet. The board would oust him. The SEC would investigate. It wouldn't just be a scandal. It would be annihilation. He looked at Sarah with new eyes. She wasn't a waitress anymore. She was a bomb sitting at his table. "Where is it?" Richard asked, his voice low and dangerous. "Safe," Sarah said. "Not in my apartment, if that's what you're thinking. Sending your goons to tear up my place won't work." Richard sighed, rubbing his temples. The aggression drained out of him. replaced by the weary pragmatism of a man negotiating a hostage situation. Okay, you have my attention. You don't want money? You want a confession? To whom? The police? The statute of limitations on intellectual property theft ran out a decade ago, Sarah. You can't put me in jail. I know, Sarah said. I don't care about jail. I care about his name. I want everyone to know that Sterling Tech was built on Penhaligon's brain. I want you to admit it, publicly. That's suicide, Richard said flatly. If I admit that, the company collapses. My reputation is destroyed. I lose everything. Then you know how Arthur felt, Sarah said mercilessly. Richard stared at her, hatred burning in his eyes. I can destroy you, Sarah. You have no idea the resources I have. I can make your life a living hell. My life is already hard, Richard, Sarah said, gesturing to her uniform. I scrub tables for minimum wage. I count pennies for medicine. You can't take away my dignity because I'm not selling it to you, and you can't take away the truth. Just then, the front doors of the restaurant opened again. The tension at the table was interrupted by the arrival of a new group. But this wasn't a lunch reservation. 2 uniformed police officers walked in, followed by a woman in a sharp grey suit. The woman scanned the room, spotted the commotion at table 4, and walked straight toward them. Richard looked up, confused. What is this? Did you call the police? No, Sarah said, equally confused. I didn't. The woman in the grey suit stopped at the table. She looked at Richard, then at Sarah. She held up a badge. Mr. Sterling? I'm Detective Miller, NYPD Fraud Division. And this? She gestured to a man walking in behind her, a man Sarah recognized immediately. It was Elias, the head waiter, who was supposed to be sick today. But he wasn't wearing his uniform. He was wearing a wire, the small black microphone taped to his chest, visible where his shirt was unbuttoned. Elias? Sarah gasped. Elias looked at Sarah with a sad smile. I'm sorry, Sarah. I'm not actually a waiter. I've been undercover at the Gilded Lily for 6 months. Richard stood up, knocking his chair over. Undercover? For what? I haven't done anything illegal here. Not here, maybe, Detective Miller said, crossing her arms. But we've been investigating the sudden liquidation of the Ohio pension funds. We've been looking for a whistleblower inside your organization. We didn't expect to find a cold case from 15 years ago sitting at table 4. Richard's face turned purple. This is entrapment. You can't use anything she said. She's lying. She's crazy. I'm not using what she said, the detective said calmly. I'm using what you said. Arthur had no vision. I took his mess and built an empire. We have audio recording of the whole conversation, Mr. Sterling. Elias was sitting at the service station the entire time. Sarah looked at Elias. He nodded at her. I knew who you were when I hired you, Sarah, Elias said softly. I recognized the name on your application. I knew your father. He was a good man. When I saw Sterling had a reservation, I called Miller. I thought, maybe if you two were in the same room, the truth might finally spill out. I didn't think you'd be brave enough to confront him like that. Richard looked between them, realizing the trap had snapped shut. He wasn't being arrested for the theft of the code. That was too old. But he had just admitted to fraud and theft on tape while under investigation for current financial crimes. It was the thread that would unravel the sweater. You set me up, Richard hissed at Sarah. You planned this. I didn't plan anything, Sarah said, feeling the adrenaline finally crash, leaving her legs weak. I just served you water. Richard lunged. It happened in a blur. Richard, driven by pure narcissistic rage, reached across the table, grabbing for Sarah's throat. You little witch! Hey! Elias shouted, diving forward. The police officers were fast, but Richard was closer, his hand connected with Sarah's shoulder, shoving her backward. She tripped over the debris of the broken glass and fell hard, her head cracking against the wooden leg of the dessert cart. Darkness swarmed the edges of her vision. She heard shouting, the sound of handcuffs clicking, and Richard screaming obscenities. Then, the world tilted sideways, and the last thing she saw was the ceiling of the Gilded Lily spinning before everything went black. Consciousness returned to Sarah in jagged, painful fragments. The first thing she registered was the relentless, rhythmic beeping of a machine. The second was a blinding white light that seemed to pierce straight through her eyelids. She tried to move her head, but a sharp spike of nausea pinned her to the pillow. "Easy, Miss Penhaligon. Try not to move." The voice was soft, professional. Sarah fluttered her eyes open. A nurse was adjusting an IV bag above her. The room was sterile, smelling of antiseptic and floor wax. It wasn't the kind of hospital room Sarah was used to. The overcrowded ER bays with curtains for walls. This was a private room. "Toby," Sarah croaked, her throat dry as sandpaper. "Where is my son?" "He's outside with a police officer and a social worker. He's fine," the nurse assured her, pouring a cup of water with a straw. "He's been drawing pictures of you as a superhero." Memory flooded back like a breaking dam. The restaurant, Richard's sneer, the shattered wine glass, the confession, the shove. Sarah tried to sit up, ignoring the nurse's protests. "How long?" "You've been out for 6 hours. You have a severe concussion and 3 stitches on your scalp. You were lucky." The door opened, and Elias walked in. He looked different without his waiter's tuxedo. He wore a rumpled windbreaker and jeans, looking less like a maitre d' and more like the exhausted undercover cop he actually was. "You're awake," Elias said, letting out a breath he seemed to have been holding for hours. He pulled a chair up to the bedside. "You scared us, Sarah." "Richard?" she asked. "In custody. For now," Elias said grimly. "Assault and battery. But his lawyers are already swarming the precinct like locusts. He'll be out on bail within the hour. Men like Sterling don't stay in cells." Sarah closed her eyes, fighting the throbbing in her temples. "And the recording?" "It's safe," Elias said. "Detective Miller logged it into evidence. We have him admitting to the pension fraud, or at least enough to open a federal inquiry. But," he hesitated. "But what?" "But regarding your father's code, the theft," Elias said, leaning in. "Richard's lawyers are already spinning it. They're going to say he was just humoring a mentally unstable employee to de-escalate the situation. Without physical proof, without that safety deposit box you mentioned, it's just your word against his, and his word is worth billions." Sarah felt a cold knot form in her stomach. She looked away, staring at the window where the New York skyline glittered in the twilight. "There is no box, Elias," she whispered. The silence in the room was heavy. Elias scrubbed a hand over his face. "I figured as much. You were bluffing." "I just wanted him to feel fear," Sarah admitted, tears leaking from the corners of her eyes. "Just for a second. I wanted him to know what it feels like to have the ground crumble under your feet. I didn't think it would go this far." "Well, it went far," Elias said, pulling out his phone. "Look at this." He turned the screen toward her. It was a social media feed. The top trending hashtag was Dachhaus, the waitress, and the wolf. Someone in the restaurant, a diner at a nearby table, had filmed the entire interaction. The video started right when Richard called her filth and ended with him shoving her into the dessert cart. It had 20 million views. The comments were a waterfall of outrage. "Who is this guy? He treats her like garbage." "That's Richard Sterling. He just laid off half my town," Did she say he stole the code? Someone find the truth. Justice for Sarah. You're not just a waitress anymore, Sarah, Elias said softly. You're a symbol. The whole world is watching. Sarah stared at the screen, watching herself. Small, trembling, but standing her ground against the giant. It didn't feel like a victory. It felt like a target had been painted on her back. What do I do? She asked. You heal, Elias said, and you get ready. Because Richard Sterling isn't going to fight this in court. He's going to fight this in the mud. He's going to come for everything you have. Elias was right. The counterattack began the next morning, even before Sarah was discharged from the hospital. Richard Sterling held a press conference on the steps of the courthouse. He looked impeccable, not a hair out of place, the picture of the aggrieved victim. The video you saw was selectively edited, Richard told the cameras, his voice smooth and confident. This woman, Sarah Penhaligon, is a troubled individual with a history of financial instability. She attempted to extort me at my table. When I tried to leave, she blocked my path. The physical contact was accidental, a result of her erratic behavior. As for her ridiculous claims about my company's origins, pure fantasy. I am filing a defamation lawsuit against Ms. Penhaligon for $50 million. Back in her basement apartment, Sarah watched the news on her cracked TV, hugging Toby so tight he squirmed. $50 million? He knew she couldn't pay. That wasn't the point. The point was to crush her with legal fees, to make her look like a liar, to silence her so thoroughly that no one would ever believe the name Penhaligon again. Her phone rang. It had been ringing non-stop with unknown numbers, reporters, trolls, death threats. She went to turn it off, but the caller ID made her pause. It didn't say unknown. It said Caldwell and Associates. Sarah answered hesitantly. Hello? Ms. Penhaligon. A deep, gravelly voice boomed on the other end. My name is James Caldwell. I'm an attorney. I watched the video of what happened at the Gilded Lily. I can't afford a lawyer, Mr. Caldwell, Sarah said, her voice shaking. I can barely afford rent. I know, Caldwell said. I don't want your money. I want Richard Sterling's head on a platter. I represented a small startup in San Francisco 3 years ago that Sterling crushed. He ruined my client's life. I've been waiting for a second shot at him. Sarah gripped the phone. He's suing me for $50 million. Let him, Caldwell said, and Sarah could practically hear the shark-like grin through the phone. That opens him up to discovery. If he sues you for lying about the code, we get to demand access to his old servers to prove you're telling the truth. He made a mistake, Sarah. His ego got the better of him. He opened the door. But I was bluffing, Sarah whispered. I don't have the proof. I don't have the safety deposit box. There was a long pause on the line. Then we have to find something else, Caldwell said firmly. Arthur Penhaligon was a coder, a creator. Men like that always leave a signature. We just have to find where he signed his work. 2 weeks later, Sarah sat in a conference room that smelled of mahogany and old leather. James Caldwell sat at the head of the table. He was an older man, with wild white hair and a suit that looked like he'd slept in it, but his eyes were sharp as flint. Across from them sat Richard Sterling's legal team. 6 lawyers in identical grey suits, looking like a phalanx of soldiers. Richard was not there. He deemed himself too important for a deposition. This is a waste of time, the lead lawyer, a woman named Ms. Vane, with lips as thin as paper cuts, sneered. Your client has no evidence. She has a fable. We are prepared to offer a settlement. Ms. Penhaligon issues a public apology, admits the extortion attempt, and we drop the $50 million suit. She signs a permanent NDA. Caldwell leaned back, putting his feet up on the table. No. Ms. Vane blinked. Excuse me? No apology. No NDA. We go to trial. You have nothing, Vane said, slamming a folder shut. We have audited the Sterling engine source code. There is no trace of Arthur Penhaligon. The metadata is clean. Richard Sterling wrote every line. So you say, Caldwell said, but we'll see what the jury thinks when they hear about the pension fraud investigation. Irrelevant to this case, Vane snapped. We will bury you, Mr. Caldwell, and we will leave your client destitute. The meeting ended in a stalemate. As they walked out of the building, the paparazzi swarm was waiting. Flashes popped like lightning. Sarah kept her head down, clutching Caldwell's arm. They're right, aren't they? Sarah asked when they were finally safe in Caldwell's car. If we don't find proof, the jury might side with him. He's powerful. People like power. We have a month before the preliminary hearings, Caldwell said, steering the car into traffic. You said your father worked from home. Yes, in the garage. Did you keep anything? Not much, Sarah said. When he died, the debts were huge. The bank took the house. They auctioned off his equipment, the servers, the desktops. All gone. Think, Sarah, Caldwell urged. Was there anything the bank didn't take? Anything personal? Sarah closed her eyes, trying to travel back 15 years. The memory of the day the auctioneers came was a blur of tears and shame. Men with clipboards tagging everything with yellow stickers. I kept his clothes, Sarah said. Some books, and his old handhelds. He loved modifying game consoles. He made one for me for my 10th birthday. A bulky grey thing. I still have it in a box under my bed. It's the only toy of mine I saved for Toby. Caldwell glanced at her. He modified the hardware. And the software, Sarah said, a faint smile touching her lips. He wrote a custom game for me, Princess Sarah's Castle. It was silly. I just jumped around collecting stars. Caldwell slammed on the brakes, causing the car behind them to honk aggressively. He pulled over to the curb, his eyes wide. He wrote a custom game, Caldwell asked slowly, on a closed system? Yes. He said he wanted me to have something no one else had. Sarah, Caldwell said, his voice trembling with excitement. A coder like Arthur. If he wanted to hide something where no corporate audit, no bank auctioneer, and no thief would ever look, he wouldn't put it on a server. He would put it in a toy. They drove to Sarah's apartment at breakneck speed. The apartment was cold. Sarah dragged the plastic storage bin from under her bed. Inside, nestled between old winter coats and photo albums, was the device. It was a grey, brick-like handheld console from the early 90s, heavy and scarred with scratches. Sarah handed it to Caldwell. He turned it on. The screen flickered to life with a pixelated chime. A crude, 8-bit title screen appeared. Princess Sarah's Castle. It still works, Sarah whispered. Caldwell didn't play the game. He pulled a specialized cable from his briefcase. He was a tech lawyer after all, and connected the antique console to his laptop. The file size, Caldwell muttered, his fingers flying across his keyboard. This cartridge, it should only hold 4 megabytes of data. But the readout says the partition is full. 64 megabytes. What does that mean? It means there's something else on here. The game is just a skin, a mask. Caldwell typed a command line. He used a partition mask. It's hidden in the background textures. He hit enter. Lines of code began to cascade down the laptop screen. It wasn't the game code. It was dense, complex mathematical algorithms. And at the top of the file, in the comment section that programmers use to leave notes, was a block of text. Caldwell read it aloud, his voice thick with emotion. Copyright 2009. Arthur Penhaligon. Project. Sterling compression. If you are reading this, Richard has done something unforgivable. I am embedding the original source code here, in the one place his greed won't let him look. A gift given out of love, not profit. This code is the property of Sarah Penhaligon. Sarah covered her mouth, a sob escaping her throat. He had known. All those years ago, he had known he wouldn't survive Richard's ambition. He hadn't left her money. He had left her the gun to kill the monster. "Is this it?" Sarah asked, tears streaming down her face. "Is this enough?" Caldwell grinned, and this time it was a genuine smile. "Sarah, this is the Holy Grail. It's time-stamped. It's digitally signed, and it predates Sterling's patent by 6 months. This proves he didn't just steal the code, he stole your inheritance. So we can win? We're not just going to win," Caldwell said, closing the laptop with a snap. "We're going to burn his kingdom to the ground." But Richard Sterling was not a man who went down quietly. The next day, Caldwell filed the new evidence with the court. By noon, the news had leaked. Sterling tech stock took a nosedive. The board of directors called an emergency meeting. Richard, cornered and desperate, made one final move. Sarah was walking Toby home from school, holding his hand tightly. The streets felt safer now that the truth was coming out. But she was still vigilant. A black sedan pulled up to the curb, pacing them slowly. The window rolled down. It wasn't Richard. It was Michael, the associate who had been at the restaurant. He looked tired, his tie undone. "Miss Penhaligon," Michael said. Sarah stopped, pulling Toby behind her. "Get away from me." "I'm not here to threaten you," Michael said, looking around nervously. "Richard he's losing it. He's talking about liquidating assets and fleeing the country before the DOJ freezes his accounts. He's going to destroy the evidence on the main servers tonight. A server migration accident." "Why are you telling me this?" Sarah asked. "Because I have a kid too," Michael said quietly. "And because I saw the video. He shoved you. I can't work for a man who does that. If he wipes those servers, your copy on the game console is strong, but it's not definitive proof of corporate usage. You need to catch him in the act of deletion." He reached out and dropped a keycard on the sidewalk. "That gets you into the server room at Sterling Tower," Michael said. "Tonight, 10 p.m. The security shift changes. The cameras will loop for 10 minutes. That's all you have." The car sped away before Sarah could say a word. She stood there, staring at the white plastic card. "Mum?" Toby tugged on her hand. "What is that?" "It's a choice, Toby," Sarah said, picking up the card. "It could be a trap. It probably was a trap. Richard could be waiting there to frame her for corporate espionage or worse. But if Michael was telling the truth and Richard destroyed the corporate logs, he could claim Arthur's code on the Game Boy was just a prototype he never actually used in the final product. The link would be broken. She needed to link the game code to the live servers. Sarah pulled out her phone and called Elias. "I need a favor," she said. "A big one." "Name it," Elias said immediately. "I need to break into Sterling Tower, and I need you to bring your badge." The lobby of Sterling Tower was a cathedral of glass and steel, silent as a tomb at 10:04 p.m. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic rhythm that drowned out the hum of the HVAC system. She wore a dark hoodie pulled up over her head, clutching the ancient grey handheld console in her pocket like a talisman. Beside her, Elias moved with the calculated grace of a seasoned officer. He swiped the keycard Michael had dropped. The light on the turnstile blinked green. "We're in," Elias whispered. "The server farm is on the 40th floor. We have 10 minutes before the shift change ends and the cameras come back online." The elevator ride was agonizingly fast. When the door slid open, the air was freezing. kept cold to protect the banks of servers that ran Richard Sterling's empire. The room was a labyrinth of blinking blue lights and humming black towers. There, Sarah pointed. In the center of the room, at the main terminal console, stood Richard Sterling. He was alone. His suit jacket was discarded on the floor, his tie loosened, his hair disheveled. He looked less like a titan of industry and more like a desperate animal chewing off its own leg to escape a trap. He was typing furiously, a progress bar on the massive main screen inching toward 100%. The header read, "System wipe, irreversible." "Richard!" Sarah's voice rang out, sharp and clear over the drone of the fans. Richard spun around, his eyes wild. He didn't look surprised. He looked manic. "You," he rasped. "I should have known Michael was weak. He always had a soft spot for charity cases." "It's over, Richard," Elias said, stepping forward, his hand resting near his hip where his service weapon was concealed. "Step away from the terminal. You're destroying evidence." "I'm cleaning house," Richard shouted, his spit flying. "This is my company. I built it. I did the work. Arthur just scribbled numbers. I turned it into billions. I won't let a waitress take it from me." He turned back to the screen and hit enter. The progress bar jumped to 99%. "You can't stop it," Richard sneered, turning back to them with a triumphant grin. "In 10 seconds the kernel is gone. The logs are gone. Your little game cartridge will be a useless relic with nothing to match against. You lose, Sarah. Again." Sarah didn't scream. She didn't attack him. She ran to the auxiliary port on the server rack nearest to her, the physical maintenance port used for hard diagnostics. "Caldwell showed me the code," Sarah said, jamming the specialized USB cable Caldwell had given her into the server, the other end connected to the Game Boy. "He showed me the header file. You thought the game was just a storage device. But Arthur didn't just hide the code, Richard. He wrote a master key." She flipped the power switch on the Game Boy. The familiar 8-bit chime of Princess Sarah's castle echoed through the high-tech server room. On the main screen, the red progress bar froze at 99%. Richard's eyes bulged. What is that? Why did it stop?" "Because the Sterling engine is built on Penhaligon architecture," Sarah said, tears stinging her eyes. "And my father programmed a failsafe. If the external key, this game, is connected, it overrides all administrative commands. It recognizes the creator." The massive screens on the wall flickered. The red warning lights turned off, replaced by a soothing, pixelated green. The text "System wipe aborted" flashed across the room. Then, the screen changed. The corporate logo of Sterling Tech vanished. In its place, pixel by pixel, a new image formed. It was a crude 8-bit drawing of a king handing a crown to a princess. Beneath it, scrolling in simple text, were the words, "Welcome home, Sarah." "Access granted. Root admin." Richard stared at the screen, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly. The arrogance, the power, the cruelty. It all evaporated, leaving a hollow, broken man. He had spent 15 years building a fortress on a foundation he didn't own, and a child's toy had just brought the walls down. "No," Richard whispered, falling to his knees. "It's not possible." "It's done," Elias said into his radio. "Move in." The doors to the stairwell burst open. A tactical team of NYPD officers flooded the room, their weapons drawn. Detective Miller walked in behind them, looking down at Richard with cold satisfaction. "Richard Sterling," Miller said, pulling out handcuffs. "You have the right to remain silent, though frankly, you've said enough." As the officers hauled a weeping Richard away, Sarah stood alone by the server rack. She looked down at the old scratched Game Boy. On the screen, the little pixelated princess was jumping up and down, celebrating her victory. "Thank you, Daddy," Sarah whispered, kissing the grey plastic case. The morning sun poured into the Gilded Lily, illuminating the fresh flowers on table 4. The restaurant was bustling, but the atmosphere was different. Lighter. Warmer. Sarah sat at table 4. She wasn't wearing an apron. She was wearing a tailored cream suit, her hair styled, looking every inch the CEO of the newly rebranded Penhaligon Systems. Across from her sat James Caldwell, who was happily devouring a lobster risotto. "The board approved the scholarship fund," Caldwell said between bites. "Full rides for STEM students from low-income backgrounds. And the insulin price cap? We rolled it out yesterday. The stock actually went up. Turns out, people like companies that don't act like villains." "And Richard?" Sarah asked, sipping her sparkling water. "Denied bail," Caldwell said with a dark chuckle. The fraud charges stuck. The evidence from the server room was the nail in the coffin. He's looking at 20 years. He's trading cigarettes for ramen noodles now. Sarah nodded, looking out the window at the park. It was the same view Richard had looked at when he called her filth. Now, it belonged to her. But she didn't feel the need to sneer at the world. She felt light. A shadow fell over the table. Sarah looked up to see a young man, nervous, holding a water pitcher. He was new. His shoes were scuffed, and his cuffs were frayed. He looked terrified. I apologize for the wait, Ms. Penhaligon," the young waiter stammered. "We're short-staffed today. I hope everything is okay?" Sarah looked at his shoes. She looked at the fear in his eyes. She remembered the weight of the invisible chains. She smiled, a genuine, warm smile that lit up the room. "The service is perfect," Sarah said. She reached into her purse and pulled out a $100 bill, placing it on the table. "What's your name?" "David, Mum." "Well, David," Sarah said, "welcome to the Gilded Lily. Don't worry about the shoes. We're going to get you a new pair." As the waiter walked away, looking like he'd just won the lottery, Sarah Penhaligon took a sip of her water. The glass was crystal, the water was cold, and for the first time in her life, the taste of success was sweet, because she was finally serving the one thing Richard Sterling never could: justice. So, the billionaire who refused to serve the poor ended up being served a 20-year sentence by the very woman he tried to crush. Richard Sterling thought his wealth made him untouchable, but he forgot the most important rule of all. You can steal an idea, but you can never steal the heart behind it. Sarah didn't just reclaim her father's company. She reclaimed her dignity, proving that true worth isn't found in a bank account, but in the strength of your character. What do you think? Did Richard get what he deserved, or was 20 years too light for a man who ruined so many lives? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story of justice and karma, please smash that like button, share this video with your friends, and don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you never miss a new story. Thanks for watching, and remember, be kind, because you never know who you're really talking to.